Let's break this down in a simple step-by-step way, as if we're learning it from scratch. What happened in 1907? 1. Indian National Congress split. In 1907, the Indian National Congress, INC, the political party fighting for India's freedom from British rule, split into two groups. One group was called the moderates and the other was called the extremists. This happened at the Surat session of the Congress. 2. Revolutionary nationalism in Bengal. At the same time, in Bengal, a part of India, revolutionary nationalism became strong. This means that some people in Bengal started believing in using force or violence to fight against British rule rather than peaceful methods. These two events, Congress splitting and revolutionary nationalism starting in Bengal, were linked. Who were the moderates? The moderates were leaders in the Congress who believed in slow, peaceful and gradual change. They thought that by talking and negotiating with the British government, they could get better rights and some freedom for Indians. Some important moderate leaders were Dadabhai Naoroji and Gopal Krishna Gokhale. What did they achieve? The moderates did a lot of important work in the early days. They helped people in India start thinking about freedom. They spoke about things like economic reforms and better treatment for Indians. They did all this when most people in India did not even think about politics or freedom because they had no idea about it. What were their weaknesses? 1. No connection with common people. The moderates did not work with ordinary people, farmers, workers, etc. They only focused on talking to British leaders, so they had no support from the masses. Their ideas and goals never reached the villages or small towns. 2. No big all-India movements. They never organised a big movement all across India. Their actions were often limited to speeches and meetings. They did not lead big movements like the Swadeshi and boycott movement, which was about using Indian-made goods and rejecting British goods. 3. Too trusting of the British. The moderates believed that the British would listen to them and make some economic and political changes, but the British government did not take them seriously. Instead of getting respect, they were often mocked by the British. The British used repression, harsh actions like arresting people to stop any protests. Why did revolutionary nationalism start in Bengal? The moderates' approach wasn't working, and many people were getting angry and frustrated with British rule. This led to some people in Bengal, especially young people, believing that force was the only way to fight. These revolutionaries believed in armed rebellion, using bombs, guns, and secret groups to attack British officers and symbols of British power. Examples for understanding. Imagine you are trying to convince a bully at school to stop bothering you by talking politely. That's what the moderates were doing. They thought talking nicely to the British would make them give Indians more rights. But after many tries, you realize the bully isn't listening, and some of your friends believe the only way to stop the bully is to fight back. That's similar to what happened with the revolutionaries. They believed in fighting the British. Why did the Congress split? The moderates wanted to keep working peacefully and slowly, but another group, called the extremists, believed that strong actions like protests, boycotts and public movements were needed to fight the British more aggressively. This disagreement led to the split in Congress in 1907. Examples of moderates and extremists. Moderates. Think of someone who tries to solve a problem calmly by talking. Extremists. Think of someone who wants to solve the problem quickly by taking stronger, sometimes forceful actions. Key takeaways. The moderates helped India by starting the fight for freedom, but they were too slow and too trusting of the British. The revolutionary nationalists believed in violent methods because they were frustrated with the slow progress of the moderates. The Congress split because of a disagreement between the moderates, peaceful, and the extremists, strong actions. Additional information. The Swadeshi movement was about promoting Indian goods and boycotting British goods. It started during the partition of Bengal in 1905, when the British divided Bengal. Many Indians were angry about this and began protesting. This split in Congress in 1907 marked an important point in India's freedom struggle. It showed that Indians were no longer willing to wait for small reforms, but wanted bigger, more immediate changes from British rule. The problem with the moderates, early Congress leaders. Who were the moderates? The moderates were a group of Indian leaders in the Indian National Congress, INC, who believed in talking peacefully with the British to bring about changes in India. They were mostly educated people, like lawyers and teachers, who thought that by discussing and asking politely, they could convince the British government to make India better. What was their approach? The moderates thought that the British government would listen to reason and gradually improve things like reducing taxes or giving Indians better rights. They believed that the British rulers were fair and that they just needed to understand the problems Indians were facing. What did they achieve? The moderates did some good things early on. They helped to raise awareness among educated Indians about their rights and got people to start thinking about the idea of an independent India. But their methods were too slow. They only involved a small elite group of Indians and didn't involve the common people, farmers, workers, etc. Why did their methods fail? By the early 1900s, their way of working, sending petitions, writing letters and holding peaceful meetings, was no longer enough. The younger generation of Indians was getting frustrated. They wanted stronger action against the British, not just peaceful requests. The moderates couldn't inspire the younger people because they weren't ready to demand change loudly. They were still hoping the British would listen if asked nicely. Example: imagine if you're part of a group in school trying to change some unfair rules. The moderates would be the students who only write polite letters to the principal. But after years of no results, younger students might want to protest loudly or demand change faster. The older group's methods would seem too slow to the younger ones. British reaction to Congress. What did the British think of Congress at first? At first, the British thought that the Congress was just a group of educated, rich people who talked about ideas but wouldn't actually do anything serious. They didn't take the Congress seriously because they thought it was just a platform for discussions among a small group. Why did they start getting worried? As the years went on, the Congress started to represent nationalism, which means the idea that India should be free from British control. More people started listening to the Congress and talking about freedom. This made the British government nervous because they didn't want to lose control over India. How did the British react? The British became openly critical of the Congress and started calling them names. They called Congress leaders disloyal Barbus. Barbus was a term the British used to refer to Indian officials, but here it meant disrespectful Indians. They called them seditious Brahmins, meaning the leaders were trying to cause trouble and rebel against the government. They even called them violent villains, although most Congress leaders at the time were very peaceful. Mocking the Congress, Lord Dufferin, who was the British Viceroy, the top official in India in the late 1800s, made fun of the Congress in public speeches. He said that the Congress was just a microscopic minority, meaning it only represented a tiny group of elite Indians, not the whole country. Another British official, George Hamilton, said the Congress leaders had a double-sided character, meaning they couldn't be trusted and were secretly working to cause trouble. Example: imagine a group of students trying to ask the school for better facilities. At first, the school ignores them, thinking it's just a small group of students who won't affect anything. But when the group starts to get more popular and more students join, the school starts criticizing them, saying they are just a bunch of troublemakers. They call them names and try to discredit them so that others won't take them seriously. The shift in Indian nationalism. What was changing in India? By the early 1900s, many Indians, especially young people, were tired of the British rule. They were not happy with just asking for small reforms anymore. These young Indians started thinking more about independence and self-rule, Swaraj. Moderates versus revolutionaries. The moderates were still focused on talking peacefully to the British and asking for small reforms. But The younger, more radical groups, often called revolutionaries, were not interested in waiting for British approval. They wanted to fight for independence more actively, sometimes even using force or organising boycotts, refusing to buy British goods. Why did the Congress split? The Congress split in 1907 into two groups. The moderates, who still wanted to pursue peaceful talks with the British. The extremists, revolutionaries, who believed in more active resistance against British rule. What was the British reaction to this split? The British were happy when the Congress split because they thought it would weaken the national movement. They tried to play the two sides against each other so that the Indian independence movement wouldn't become strong. Example. If we go back to the school analogy, imagine that after years of writing letters to the principal, some students want to start protests or strikes to get the changes they want. The older students, moderates, still want to keep writing polite letters, but the younger students, revolutionaries, are done waiting and want to demand faster action. This split in the group weakens their efforts because they are no longer working together. Why is this important? The moderates' methods were too slow. The younger generation was ready for faster change and action. They were getting angry and frustrated with the British rule, but the moderates were still hoping to make changes by talking peacefully. The moderates failed to see that India's situation had changed. All right, let's break this down step by step, just like you asked, and explain it in the simplest way possible. Hostility toward the moderates. The moderates were the early leaders of the Indian National Congress, INC, who believed in working with the British government in a peaceful way. However, even though they were polite and respectful, the British government didn't like them. In fact, the British wanted to get rid of the Congress completely. Let's see why. 1. British reaction to the moderates. Even though the moderates tried to be friendly with the British saw them as a threat. The British didn't care that the moderates were peaceful or loyal because they still talked about nationalism, which means they wanted Indians to have their own country and rule themselves. Example. Imagine you're in school and some students, moderates, are politely asking the principal to change some unfair rules. Even though these students are nice, the principal gets angry because they're still challenging his authority and asking for change. Number 2. Why did the British dislike the moderates? Nationalism. The British government saw the moderates as people who were spreading ideas about freedom and independence. Even if they were polite, they were still talking about ending British rule. This made the British angry. Curzon's view. Curzon, who was the British viceroy, the highest British official in India, didn't trust the moderates. He thought that they were secretly trying to end British rule while pretending to be loyal. He said this about Gokhale, one of the moderate leaders. You can't wake up people's national spirit, love for their country, and also act like you support British rule. Example. Imagine if you tell your teacher that you love the school, but then complain about all the unfair rules. The teacher might not believe you're really loyal to the school if you keep pointing out its problems. Hypocrisy? Double standards? Another British official, George Hamilton, told one of the Congress leaders, Dadabhai Naoroji, that the moderates were acting like they supported the British, but then criticised the problems that came from British rule. He said they were being two-faced, showing two different attitudes. Example? This is like saying you support your school, but every time you talk about it, you only complain about the bad things, like unfair homework or bad rules. 3. The British thought the moderates were weak. The British didn't just dislike the moderates, they thought they could easily defeat them. They believed the moderates were weak because no popular support. The British thought the moderates were only supported by a small group of educated Indians like lawyers and teachers. They didn't think that regular people like farmers or workers supported the moderates. This made the British feel strong. Curzon's ambition. Curzon was very confident that he could destroy the Congress. He even said in the year 1900 that the Congress was about to collapse, fall apart, and that he wanted to help it die peacefully. He also said that ever since he came to India, his goal was to make the Congress powerless. Example, it's like a principal saying, this group of students is too small and weak to cause any real change in the school. I'm going to make sure they give up, refusing to meet. In 1904, Curzon even insulted the Congress by refusing to meet their leaders. The Congress leaders wanted to talk with Curzon, but he didn't respect them enough to meet with them. Example, imagine if some students want to meet with the principal to talk about changing the school rules, but the principal refuses to even talk to them because he doesn't think they are important. Why did the British want to destroy the Congress? 1. Even moderates were nationalists. The British didn't care that the moderates were peaceful. The fact that they were spreading ideas about India becoming independent was enough to make the British government see them as a problem. Example, even if you're being polite to your teacher, if you keep asking for big changes, like letting students make the rules, the teacher might still see you as a threat. 2. Moderates were weak. The British thought the moderates were weak because they didn't have the support of the masses, like farmers, workers, etc. They believed that if they pushed hard enough, they could make the Congress fall apart. Example, if the school principal thinks that only a few students care about changing the rules, he might feel confident that he can ignore them and their group will soon give up. Extra information towards more. The rise of the extremists, revolutionaries. Around the same time, a new group of leaders was emerging in India. They were called extremists or revolutionaries. Unlike the moderates, they believed in taking action and sometimes using force or protest to fight British rule. This made the British even more worried, and they wanted to stop the Congress before these new, more aggressive leaders took control. Example, if the polite students in school don't get results and younger, more angry students start planning protests, the school will worry more and might try to stop all students from protesting. Conclusion. The British saw the moderates as a problem, not because they were violent or aggressive, but because they were still talking about Indian nationalism and independence. The British thought they could easily crush the Congress because it didn't have the support of most Indians, and they believed that the Congress was weak and wouldn't last long. They used insults, ignored the Congress leaders, and hoped the Congress would eventually collapse. Does that make sense? Feel free to ask more questions if anything is unclear. Let's break down this paragraph into the simplest, easy-to-understand language step by step. We'll explain every part as if we're teaching someone with no knowledge of history. I'll also add extra explanations and examples to help make things clear. 1. Change in British policy. The British government had been very harsh toward the Congress and the nationalists, people fighting for India's freedom. But when the Swadeshi and boycott movement started, the British realized they needed to change their approach. Swadeshi movement. This was a movement where Indians began using their own goods and rejecting British goods. Boycott movement. Indians stopped buying British products to hurt British businesses. These movements made the nationalist movement stronger, and more Indians started fighting against British rule. This forced the British to come up with a new plan. Example, imagine if some students in school want to change the rules and start convincing other students to stop following unfair rules. If the protest becomes strong, the principal can no longer ignore it and has to change how he handles things. Number 2, new policy, carrot and stick. The British came up with a new plan to weaken the Indian nationalists. It was called the stick policy. Carrot, this means rewards or offering something nice. This means punishment or being harsh. This strategy had 3 parts, like 3 tools in a plan. 1. Repression. This means using force or punishment to control the radicals. 2. Conciliation. This means being friendly or offering rewards to the moderates. 3. Suppression. This means using full power to crush the radicals. The goal of the British was to divide the two groups, moderates and radicals, so they couldn't work together. Example. It's like if a teacher wants to stop a group of students who are protesting unfair rules. She might, 1. Scare the more aggressive students, radicals, by punishing them lightly at first. 2. Make promises to the polite students, moderates, to try to get them on her side. 3. Once the polite students, moderates, leave the protest, she can use all her power to stop the aggressive ones, radicals. 3. Who were the moderates and radicals? Moderates. These were early Congress leaders who wanted to work peacefully with the British to get some freedom for India. They didn't believe in violence or strong protests. Example. Think of them as the students who asked the principal politely to change the school rules. Radicals. These were the leaders who believed in strong action. They wanted to protest and even fight if needed to get freedom. They didn't believe in being polite to the British anymore. Think of them as the students who want to protest loudly, boycott school activities, and force change. 4. Three-part plan explained. The British wanted to separate these two groups. Their plan was, 1. Repress the radicals. Mild British would punish the radicals, but they wouldn't be too harsh at first. They wanted to scare the moderates by showing them what could happen if they became too aggressive. Example. If the teacher gives a mild punishment to the aggressive students, it's to warn the polite students, look what might happen to you if you don't stay calm. 2. Conciliate the moderates. Give them some promises. The British would offer the moderates some rewards and make them think that if they stayed peaceful, they would get more concessions, benefits. This was to tempt the moderates to leave the radicals. Example. If the teacher tells the polite students, if you stop hanging out with the aggressive ones, I'll change some rules for you, it's like offering a carrot reward to get them to stop protesting. 3. Suppress the radicals. Once moderates were out of the way. Once the moderates fell into the trap, trusted the British would use full force to stop the radicals. Example. Once the teacher has convinced the polite students to stop protesting, she can punish the aggressive ones without worrying about upsetting anyone else. Number 5. British goal. Isolate the radicals. The entire goal of this plan was to separate the radicals from the moderates. The British wanted the moderates to stop supporting the radicals so that they could deal with each group more easily. Isolate the radicals. Once the moderates stepped away, the radicals would be alone and easier to crush. Trap the moderates? Once the radicals were crushed, the British didn't need the moderates anymore, and they could ignore them. 6. Why this plan worked against the nationalists? Unfortunately, neither the moderates nor the radicals realized what the British were doing. They didn't understand that the British were trying to divide them. Because of this, both groups ended up losing. Example, it's like the students, both polite and aggressive, didn't realize that the teacher was playing them against each other. By the time they understood the trick, it was too late and both groups lost the protest. Conclusion. The British government, after facing strong movements like Swadeshi and boycott, decided to weaken the nationalists by dividing them. They used a strategy called the carrot and stick, offering rewards to the moderates while scaring and punishing the radicals. The whole goal was to separate these two groups so that the British could deal with them more easily. Sadly, both groups didn't understand this plan, and the British succeeded in weakening the nationalists for a time. Feel free to ask more questions if anything is unclear or if you want more examples. Let's break this down further into even simpler steps, going slow and explaining every idea in detail. 1. The British faced strong movements. In the early 1900s, Indians were becoming more active in fighting for freedom from British rule. Two movements became very powerful. Swadeshi movement. This means using only Indian-made goods and rejecting British goods. Boycott movement. This means refusing to buy or use British products. These movements made the nationalist movement stronger, and many Indians joined the fight for freedom. Example: imagine in a school, students start making their own notebooks instead of buying from the school store because they think the school's rules are unfair. If more students join in, the school will start losing money and the principal has to do something about it. 2. British decide to change their policy. The British rulers realised that their old way of dealing with Indian nationalists was not working. They used to ignore or insult the Indian leaders, but now they knew they needed to change their strategy. So they came up with a new plan. This plan was called the carrot and stick policy. Carrot 3. What is the carrot and stick policy? Imagine you are trying to control a donkey. If you offer the donkey a carrot, a reward in front of it, the donkey will follow you to get it. But if the donkey doesn't move, you might use a stick, a punishment, to make it walk. The British used this idea to deal with the Indian leaders. 4. Who were the two groups? There were two main groups of Indian leaders fighting for freedom. Moderates. These leaders wanted to talk to the British peacefully. They hoped to get some small reforms and changes from the British by being polite. Example: they are like students in a school who ask the principal politely to change the rules. Radicals. These leaders believed that India should take stronger actions, like protests and boycotts, to force the British to leave. Example: they are like students who are angry at the principal and want to protest loudly and make things happen quickly. The British plan? The British wanted to weaken the Indian nationalists. Their plan had 3 parts, using both carrot, reward, and stick, punishment. Part 1, repress the radicals, mild punishment. The British decided to scare the radicals by giving them some punishment, but not too harsh at first. The idea was to frighten the moderates and make them worry, if we get too aggressive like the radicals, we might be punished too. Example: in school, if the principal lightly punishes the aggressive students who are protesting, it's a warning to the peaceful students. It's like saying, you could be next if you don't behave. Part 2, conciliate the moderates, give promises. The British then offered the moderates some rewards or promises. They said, if you stay calm and peaceful, we will give you some reforms. We might give you more later if you don't join the radicals. The goal was to tempt the moderates to leave the radicals and not support them. Example: the principal tells the polite students, if you stop supporting the aggressive students, I will change some rules for you. This is the carrot, reward part. Part 3, suppress the radicals, full punishment. Once the moderates fell into the British trap and stayed peaceful, the British would crush the radicals with full power. The British no longer needed to worry about the moderates because they were on their side now. Example: after the polite students stop protesting and side with the principal can punish the aggressive students fully without worrying about upsetting everyone. 6. British goal: isolate the radicals. The entire goal of this plan was to separate the two groups, the moderates and the radicals. The British wanted the moderates to step away from the radicals. Once the radicals were alone, it would be easier for the British to crush them. After the radicals were defeated, the British could ignore the moderates because the moderates didn't want to fight aggressively anyway. Example: it's like if the principal manages to separate the polite students from the aggressive ones. Once the aggressive students are left alone, it's easier for the principal to punish them. After punishing the aggressive students, the principal doesn't need to worry about the polite students because they are not causing trouble. And 7. Why did this work against the Indian nationalists? Unfortunately, neither the moderates nor the radicals realised what the British were trying to do. They didn't see the trick the British were playing to divide them. Because of this, the moderates thought the British would give them real reforms, so they stayed peaceful. The radicals got no support from the moderates, so they were easily punished by the British. Both groups lost in the end, and the national movement was weakened for a time. Example: It's like the students didn't understand the principal's plan. By the time they realized the principal was tricking them, it was too late, and both the polite students and the aggressive students lost their protest. Conclusion. The British, after facing strong protests from Indians through the Swadeshi and boycott movement, came up with a clever plan to weaken the nationalists. They used the carrot and stick policy, where they tried to divide the moderates, peaceful leaders, and the radicals, aggressive leaders. They offered rewards to the moderates and punished the radicals. In the end, this plan worked for the British because it divided the Indian leaders and made them weaker. Neither the moderates nor the radicals understood the British strategy, and they both suffered because of it. If any part is still unclear, feel free to ask and I'll explain further. All right, let's break this down in the simplest way possible, step by step. 1. Who were Lord Minto and John Morley? Lord Minto was the Viceroy of India at this time. The Viceroy was like the head of the British government in India. John Morley was the Secretary of State for India. He was like a powerful British official who helped make decisions about how India was governed. 2. What did they offer? In 1906, Lord Minto and John Morley thought of a plan. They knew there were two groups in India fighting for freedom from British rule. The moderates, who wanted to talk peacefully and get small changes from the British. The radicals, who wanted to take strong actions to force the British out. So the British offered some new reforms, small changes, in the legislative councils. These councils were groups that made laws in India, but the British still controlled them. The reforms meant that maybe Indians could have a bit more say in making decisions. 3. What did the moderates do? The moderates liked this offer. They thought, if we work with the British and discuss these reforms, we might get some small changes for India. So they decided to cooperate with the British and talk about the reforms. Example, it's like if in a school, the principal tells some students, if you talk to me nicely, I might let you have a say in the school rules. These students agree to talk, hoping for some small changes. 4. What was the problem? At the same time, a big popular movement was going on in the country. This means many people were protesting and fighting against British rule. The radicals were leading this fight, and they didn't want to just talk. They wanted strong actions to force the British out. But the British government was trying to stop this movement. The British hoped that by talking to the moderates, they could divide the Indian leaders. Example, imagine if a group of students in a school are protesting against unfair rules. While the principal is trying to stop the protest, some students agree to talk peacefully with the principal. This creates a split between the peaceful students and the protesting ones. 5. What happened next? Because the moderates agreed to talk with the British while the radicals were protesting, there was a split in the nationalist movement. The moderates were seen as cooperating with the British. The radicals felt that the moderates were not fighting hard enough. This weakened the movement for freedom because the two groups, instead of working together, were now divided. Example, in the school, the group of students who were protesting might feel betrayed by the peaceful students who decided to talk with the principal. This division weakens the overall fight for change. 6. British strategy, divide and rule. The British used this tactic of dividing the leaders to weaken the fight for freedom. They knew that if the Indian leaders were united, they would be stronger. So the British tried to divide them by giving some groups small promises, like the reforms for the moderates, and suppressing the other groups, like the radicals. This was called the divide and rule policy. The British used it again and again in later years to weaken the Indian freedom movement. 7. Examples of this strategy later on. In 1924, the British tried to divide the Swarajists, another group fighting for Indian freedom. In 1936, the British tried to create a split between Jawaharlal Nehru, a leader of the Indian National Congress, and other leaders from the leftist, more radical side. 8. Lesson learned by Indian leaders. In later years, Indian leaders realized that they had made a mistake in 1907 to 1909 by falling into the British trap of division. They understood that if they stayed united, the British couldn't easily defeat them. In the 1920s and 1930s, even though the Indian leaders had disagreements, they refused to let the British divide them. They stayed united despite having different ideas about how to fight for freedom. Example: imagine that after being tricked by the principal once, the students in the school learn to stay together. Even if some students want to protest and others want to talk, they all agree not to let the principal divide them again. This way, they are stronger together. Conclusion: in 1906, the British offered some reforms to the moderates to try and divide the Indian leaders. The moderates agreed to talk, but the radicals were angry because they were still fighting against British rule. This caused a split in the nationalist movement, making it weaker. The British used this divide and rule strategy many times, but in later years, Indian leaders learned their lesson and stayed united. If any part is unclear, feel free to ask and have more. Let's go through this step by step in the simplest way. 1. What was happening between 1905 to 1907? In these years, the moderates and radicals were fighting for India's freedom from British rule, but they had different ideas on how to do it. Even though they worked together to fight against the partitioning of Bengal, they started to disagree more and more on what should happen next. 2. What did the radicals want? The radicals were the group that wanted to take strong actions against the British. They had two main ideas. 1. They wanted to extend the Swadeshi movement and the boycott movement, which started in Bengal, to the entire country. Swadeshi movement. This was a movement to only use Indian-made goods and reject British-made products. Boycott movement. This meant refusing to buy British goods and even stopping all cooperation with the British government. 2. They wanted to go further. The radicals didn't just want to stop using British goods, they wanted to stop cooperating with the colonial government entirely. That means they didn't want to help the British in any way. Example: imagine in a school, some students say, not only will we stop buying things from the school store, but we'll stop following the school rules and refuse to work with the principal at all. 3. What did the moderates want? The moderates had a different approach. They were more careful and didn't want to make big moves like the radicals. Here's what they wanted. 1. They wanted to keep the boycott movement limited to Bengal. They thought it was best to fight in Bengal only, not in the whole country. 2. They were opposed to the idea of boycotting the government. They thought it was too extreme to stop working with the British government. Example: if the school has some unfair rules, these students say, we will only stop buying from the school store in our class, but we should still follow the school rules and cooperate with the principal. 4. Calcutta Congress in 1906. The big disagreement. In 1906, there was a big Congress meeting in Calcutta where things almost got really bad. The two groups, moderates and radicals, were fighting over who would become the president of the Congress. Both sides wanted someone who supported their views, but to avoid a split, they all agreed on one person, Dadabhai Naoroji. Everyone respected him because he was a great patriot and a leader for India's freedom.
5. What did they agree on?
Even though they disagreed on many things, they were able to come to a compromise, an agreement where both sides give up something to find a middle ground. They agreed on 4 decisions related to the freedom movement. 1. Swadeshi movement, use Indian goods. 2. Boycott movement, boycott British goods. 3. National education, promote Indian education, not British style. 4. Self-government, the demand for India to govern itself. Example, in a school protest, the students agree on a few key things: buying only from their own local shops, refusing to buy from the school store, creating their own study groups and asking the principal for more say in the school rules. 6. The fight continues in 1907. Throughout 1907, the moderates and radicals kept fighting over what these 4 resolutions really meant. The radicals thought it was time for a big push for freedom. They believed the Indian people were ready to fight hard, and the moderates were holding them back. The moderates, on the other hand, wanted to proceed carefully. They didn't want to push too hard and create chaos. By the end of 1907, the 2 groups were fighting with each other instead of working together. 7. Radicals want to take over. The radicals, led by Aurobindo Ghosh, felt that it was time to get rid of the moderates. They believed that the moderates were slowing down the freedom movement. The radicals thought that if the moderates couldn't be removed from power, it would be better to split the Congress. Example. In a school, imagine that the group of students who want to protest in a big way says, "These careful students are holding us back. If they don't let us lead the protest, we should break away and form our own group." 8. Summary. 1. Radicals wanted to spread the boycott and Swadeshi movements across India and stop cooperating with the British government entirely. 2. Moderates wanted to keep the boycott limited to Bengal and didn't want to completely break ties with the British. 3. In 1906, at the Calcutta Congress, a split was avoided by choosing Dadabhai Naoroji as president. 4. 4 resolutions were passed, but the 2 groups continued to fight about how to carry them out. 5. By the end of 1907, the radicals felt the moderates were holding back the movement at the time to part ways or take over. Does this explanation help? Let me know if you need anything explained further. Let's go through this step by step in the simplest way. 1. What was happening between 1905 to 1907? In these years, the moderates and radicals were fighting for India's freedom from British rule, but they had different ideas on how to do it. Even though they worked together to fight against the partitioning of Bengal, they started to disagree more and more on what should happen next.
2.
What did the radicals want? The radicals were the group that wanted to take strong actions against the British. They had 2 main ideas. 1, they wanted to extend the Swadeshi movement and the boycott movement, which started in Bengal, to the entire country. Swadeshi movement. This was a movement to only use Indian-made goods and reject British-made products. Boycott movement. This meant refusing to buy British goods and even stopping all cooperation with the British government. 2. They wanted to go further. The radicals didn't just want to stop using British goods, they wanted to stop cooperating with the colonial government entirely. That means they didn't want to help the British in any way. Example. Imagine in a school, some students say, "Not only will we stop buying things from the school store, but we'll stop following the school rules and refuse to work with the principal at all."
3.
What did the moderates want? The moderates had a different approach. They were more careful and didn't want to make big moves like the radicals. Here's what they wanted. 1, they wanted to keep the boycott movement limited to Bengal. They thought it was best to fight in Bengal only, not in the whole country. 2, they were opposed to the idea of boycotting the government. They thought it was too extreme to stop working with the British government. Example. If the school has some unfair rules, these students say, "We will only stop buying from the school store in our class, but we should still follow the school rules and cooperate with the principal." 4. Calcutta Congress in 1906. The big disagreement. In 1906, there was a big Congress meeting in Calcutta where things almost got really bad. The 2 groups, moderates and radicals, were fighting over who would become the president of the Congress. Both sides wanted someone who supported their views, but to avoid a split, they all agreed on one person, Dadabhai Naoroji. Everyone respected him because he was a great patriot and a leader for India's freedom.
5. What did they agree on?
Even though they disagreed on many things, they were able to come to a compromise, an agreement where both sides give up something to find a middle ground. They agreed on 4 decisions related to the freedom movement. 1. Swadeshi movement, use Indian goods. 2. Boycott movement, boycott British goods. 3. National education, promote Indian education, not British style. 4. Self-government, the demand for India to govern itself. Example, in a school protest, the students agree on a few key things: buying only from their own local shops, refusing to buy from the school store, creating their own study groups, and asking the principal for more say in the school rules. 6. The fight continues in 1907. Throughout 1907, the moderates and radicals kept fighting over what these 4 resolutions really meant. The radicals thought it was time for a big push for freedom. They believed the Indian people were ready to fight hard, and the moderates were holding them back. The moderates, on the other hand, wanted to proceed carefully. They didn't want to push too hard and create chaos. By the end of 1907, the 2 groups were fighting with each other instead of working together. 7. Radicals want to take over. The radicals, led by Aurobindo Ghosh, felt that it was time to get rid of the moderates. They believed that the moderates were slowing down the freedom movement. The radicals thought that if the moderates couldn't be removed from power, it would be better to split the Congress. Example, in a school, imagine that the group of students who want to protest in a big way says, "These careful students are holding us back. If they don't let us lead the protest, we should break away and form our own group." 8. Summary. 1. Radicals wanted to spread the boycott and Swadeshi movements across India and stop cooperating with the British government entirely. 2. Moderates wanted to keep the boycott limited to Bengal and didn't want to completely break ties with the British. 3. In 1906, at the Calcutta Congress, a split was avoided by choosing Dadabhai Naoroji as president. 4. 4 resolutions were passed, but the 2 groups continued to fight about how to carry them out. 5. By the end of 1907, the radicals felt the moderates were holding back the movement at the time to part ways or take over. Does this explanation help? Let me know if you need anything explained further. Let's break this down into the simplest steps so you can understand every part clearly. 1. Who were the moderates? The moderates were the group of Indian leaders who believed in making slow, careful changes to get India more power in the British government. They wanted to talk and negotiate with the British instead of taking strong actions like protests or boycotts. 2. What was the problem? The moderates were starting to disagree with the radicals, who wanted strong actions like the boycott and protests. The moderates were worried about staying in the Congress with the radicals for a few reasons. 1. They felt that staying with the radicals would lead them into dangerous situations. 2. The Congress, the group fighting for India's freedom, had been built slowly over 20 years. The moderates were afraid that the radicals' actions would destroy it. 3. The moderates knew the British government was very powerful, and they thought that if the Congress did something too bold, the British would crush it quickly. 3. Example to understand. Imagine you and some friends are trying to change the school rules. You've been talking with the teachers and slowly getting them to listen to your ideas, but some other friends want to protest and make a big scene. You're worried that the principal might punish everyone if you all join the protest. You want to keep talking instead of doing something that might get everyone in trouble. This is how the moderates felt about the radicals. 4. Gokhale's warning. One of the moderates, Gopal Krishna Gokhale, said in 1907 that the radicals were not understanding how powerful the British government was. He warned the radicals that if they did something like a big protest, the British could easily shut it down. He said the British government had enough power to stop the Congress in just 5 minutes. 5. Hope from Minto and Morley. Two important British leaders at the time were Lord Minto, the Viceroy, and John Morley, the Secretary of State for India. They were giving the moderates hope. They promised that the British government might give more power to Indians soon. The moderates thought, if we keep being patient, we might finally get political and administrative power from the British. 6. Moderates' fear of radical pressure. The moderates were afraid that if the radicals pushed for big actions like protests or boycotts, it could annoy the people in power in Britain who were helping India, like liberals, who were politicians that supported giving more rights to Indians. 7. Why did some moderates want to split? Many moderates, especially those led by Firozeshah Mehta, thought that they should split from the radicals. Here's why. They believed the radicals were too extreme and were putting the Congress in danger. They thought that the Congress could still make progress if they got rid of the radicals and didn't let their actions ruin everything. 8. Example from H.A. Wadia. One of the moderates, H.A. Wadia, wrote about the situation using a medical example. He said the radicals were like a diseased limb, an arm or a leg that is sick, and the Congress was like a healthy body. He believed the only way to save the Congress from dying was to cut off the diseased limb, which meant getting rid of the radicals.
9.
Example to understand. Imagine the Congress is like a team working together on a project. If one group in the team wants to do things that might get the team in trouble, some members think it's better to remove those people to save the project.
10.
Summary. 1. Moderates were afraid that staying with the radicals would lead to danger and destroy the Congress. 2. Gokhale warned that the British government was too powerful and they could easily stop any bold actions from the Congress. 3. The moderates had hope that British leaders like Minto and Morley would soon give Indians more power. 4. Some moderates, like Firozeshah Mehta, wanted to split from the radicals to protect the Congress. 5. H.A. Wadia used an example, saying the radicals were like a diseased limb and the only way to save the Congress was to cut them off. Does this explanation make sense? Let me know if you'd like any part of it explained more. Here is the text you requested, copied exactly as it is. 1. Both sides had it wrong. Here are talking about two groups in the Indian National Congress around 1905 to 1907. Moderates. They wanted to work slowly and carefully with the British government. Radicals, or extremists. They wanted to take strong, aggressive action to push the British out. What this means, both these groups were wrong in their thinking. They didn't fully understand how to get freedom for India, and they also didn't understand how they could work better with each other. The moderates didn't realise that they weren't negotiating with the British because they were strong. The British were talking to them because they were afraid of the radicals causing more trouble. The radicals didn't realise that the moderates were like their safety net. The moderates were helping keep the fight peaceful and were protecting some of their rights, like the right to speak freely or organise. Without this protection, the radicals wouldn't be strong enough to fight on their own. Number 2. Mistake of the moderates. Let's break down the moderates' mistake. The moderates thought they were important because the British government was talking to them. They believed that the British were willing to negotiate with them because they were strong and influential. But this wasn't true. The British only started negotiating with the moderates because they were afraid of the radicals creating bigger problems, like more protests or violence. Imagine this. You have two groups in a classroom. One group is always quiet, moderates, and the other group is rowdy, radicals. The teacher only starts listening to the quiet group because they want to avoid the rowdy group causing trouble. 3. Mistake of the radicals. Now, let's talk about the radicals' mistake. The radicals thought they could fight the British government all by themselves. They didn't see that the moderates were like their first layer of protection. The moderates helped keep things peaceful and protected the rights of all Indian people, like the right to speak out or protest. Without this protection, the radicals would be crushed by the British, who had a lot of power and strength. For example, the moderates were like the shield in front of the radicals. The radicals didn't realize how much they needed this shield to keep themselves safe. 4. Both sides needed to work together. Here's the key point. Neither side understood that only a united movement where both groups worked together would have any chance to succeed against the powerful British Empire. India is a huge country, and to fight a powerful country like Britain, they needed all Indians to come together. Let's imagine it's like playing a sport, and 2 of the best players on the team refuse to work together. They can't win the game unless they cooperate. 5. Tilak and Gokhale, the leaders. Now, let's talk about the main leaders of the 2 groups. Tilak led the radicals, or extremists. Gokhale led the moderates, or early nationalists. These 2 leaders were very smart and mature. They understood the importance of unity, working together in the fight for freedom. Even though their followers were ready to fight against each other, both Tilak and Gokhale knew that disunity would only help the British, not the Indian people. 6. Tilak's plan for unity. Tilak, the radical leader, didn't want to break away from the moderates. He understood that both groups needed to work together. Tilak knew that they couldn't build a strong movement against the British if the 2 groups, radicals and moderates, were fighting each other. He thought the best way forward was to gather massive support for the radical ideas. Then, he could use this support to convince the moderates to compromise and work together. Tilak's strategy was not to break away, but to force the moderates to agree on a common path where they could push the British government for more freedom. 7. Tilak's problem. Even though Tilak wanted to stay united with the moderates, he faced a big problem. Tilak had become very popular, especially in Maharashtra. Many people supported him. The radicals in Bengal were also pushing him to take stronger, more aggressive steps against British. Tilak was caught in a difficult situation. His supporters wanted him to take extreme actions, but he knew that staying united with the moderates was important for the larger fight. He was like someone riding a tiger. Once he got on, he couldn't just get off easily. The situation had become so intense that Tilak couldn't back down anymore. 8. Tilak's final decision. In the end, when things reached a critical point, Tilak had no choice but to side with the more radical leaders like Aurobindo Ghose. Even though Tilak didn't want to break unity, he was forced to go along with the more extreme actions of the radicals because of the pressure from his supporters. Example to understand this better. Imagine a school where there are 2 groups of students. One group wants to work with the school and follow its rules carefully to make changes, moderates. The other group wants to protest and fight against the school's rules because they think that's the only way to make changes, radicals. The school listens to the moderates, but only because they're worried the radicals might create a bigger problem. The radicals, on the other hand, don't realize that without the moderates, the school would come down on them with full force, and they wouldn't be able to handle it alone. In the middle of all this, a smart student leader, Tilak, knows that the 2 groups should work together, but when his supporters start pushing him to take extreme action, he finds himself in a tough spot, like riding a tiger. Even though he wants unity, he's forced to side with the extreme group in the end. Final takeaway. The moderates and radicals both made mistakes by not understanding how much they needed each other. Tilak and Gokhale, the main leaders, understood the importance of staying united in the fight for India's freedom. Tilak didn't want to break the unity, but the pressure from his supporters forced him to take extreme steps and side with the radicals. Let me know if you need further assistance with this.